One of the things that I've learned from reading Drucker in my current role as management writer for the Financial Times is that he always wanted us to challenge assumptions. And probably the biggest assumption in the corporate world of the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s was that the pursuit of shareholder value was the best guide for corporate managers and leaders. And we're going to tackle that question, not just from the point of view ably laid out for us by Roger Martin this morning, but also in an attempt to work out what can be salvaged from shareholder value that is useful and what the future of shareholder capitalism looks like. And we're going to open with two keynotes, starting with my counterpart, an illustrious columnist of The Economist, Adrian Wooldridge. Adrian.
Andrew, thank you very, very much for that introduction. The poet Shelley once said that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of mankind. And I think we could also say the same thing these days, unfortunately perhaps, about management writers and management gurus. They seem to have an unnaturally large influence on the way that we live our lives. In the 1980s and 1990s, the idea that really changed the world as much as any management idea was the idea of shareholder value, that the purpose of companies really is to maximize shareholder value. This was the ultimate metric which companies should use to see how efficiently they were running. This changed the way that companies operate. It changed the way that CEOs and other managers were remunerated. It really was the guiding idea that all companies, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, but not only in the Anglo-Saxon world, used to measure how effectively they were operating. Now, what we're seeing at the moment is a huge reaction against that idea. It's a reaction, really, of course, that was consolidated by the 2007-2008 financial crisis, which was blamed on the unrestrained pursuit of shareholder value. But it's an idea which had been gathering pace with some help from Peter Drucker and others long before that. And the notion really was that the pursuit of shareholder value was forcing companies to act in a much too short-term way, that they were too focused on quarterly earnings, that they were giving too many incentives to managers to maximize the value of the company in the short term rather than in the long term, that investors were obsessed by the short term, holding shares on a very, very short-term basis. In 1960, the average investor in the New York Stock Exchange held their shares for 8 years. Today, it's about 4 months. There is also the rise of, as we heard this morning, of electronic trading, whereby people opt in and out of ownership of companies by the minute, by the millisecond. And they're not really focused on the long-term health of companies. They are, as we heard, gaming the system. So there were a lot of worries about short-termism, and particularly also this coincides with CEOs seeing the length of time that they spent as CEOs collapsing. It's now down to about 4 to 6 years, having been much longer in the past. So everything seems to be pushing companies and investors to take a short-term view rather than a long-term view, and that worry was sort of reinforced massively by the financial crisis. And I think now we're moving away from a world in which the pursuit of shareholder value was the commonly accepted metric to a world in which we're looking for a different sort of metric, but there are a lot of people who think the pursuit of shareholder value is a disastrously bad metric. And we heard, I think, today it described as a crummy idea. I think we heard today people talking about the funeral of this particular model of capitalism. And what really worries me, and what I want to address in my remarks today, is the idea that we're going to move from one extreme view, which is that the pursuit of shareholder value is the be-all and end-all of capitalism, to another extreme view, that the pursuit of shareholder value, quarterly earnings, and the rest of it has no value whatsoever. Indeed, it's a system which leads to disastrous short-termism and even to economic crises. And I think That's dangerous to move from one extreme view to another, and it's getting things wrong. Basically, I think that shareholder value is a very valuable tool. It's a very valuable servant and a very dangerous master. So we shouldn't treat it as a master, but we shouldn't simply cast it aside as a result of the financial crisis. To start off with, it strikes me that the alternative systems which we're being presented with have even bigger problems than shareholder value. One thing people say is that we shouldn't be looking at shareholder value as the best metric. We should be looking at stakeholder value as the best metric. Obviously, a very popular idea in Austria and Central Europe. But I worry about stakeholder value for several reasons. One reason is that I think it can institutionalize dithering as different elements within the company and different constituencies within the company try and get an advantage over the others for decision making. Secondly, I think that it can give enormous power to managers. Now, what Michael Jensen was saying when he launched the whole shareholder value movement was that managers are rent seekers, that they will always try and get hold of bigger offices, more elaborate jets and the rest of it. Now, he might have gone too far with that, but there is a sense in which managers can be rent seekers, and stakeholder value gives them a chance to pick off various constituencies, to shift their support from one constituency to another, and to make sure that they are always the people making the ultimate decisions, that they're not held to account to any external set of standards. So I think that stakeholder value is a dangerously vague and infinitely manipulable system. So I think we have to be careful about that. Secondly, the notion that shareholder value encourages too much short-termism. That can be true, but not necessarily so. First of all, I think the antithesis between short-term health and long-term health can be rather a false antithesis. If I go to the doctor every 4 months and I get a report on my health saying you're terribly unhealthy, that's not because I'm unhealthy in the previous day or week, it's because they're reporting on my long-term health. Exactly the same with shareholder reports, every quarterly earnings, that what you're measuring is not simply a set of manipulable short-term results, but you're measuring the long-term health of a company. Every short-term result will involve within itself a long-term result. Secondly, I think it's quite important to be aware of short-term warning signs. Capital can be too patient as well as too short-term. If you look at the Danish company Vestas, I think it's lost 90% of its shareholder value in the last 4 years. The CEO is still in place. I would say he shouldn't be in place. We should have got rid of him. Companies can be much too patient. Or if you look at what happened to Nokia under its former CEO, he was there for 4 or 5 years as the company absolutely collapsed in value. They should not have kept that man on for so long. The company would be in a much better position now if it had taken notice of short-term shareholder results, if it had been less patient. And I think we also have to remember that the pace of change in the modern economy is incredibly fast. It's getting faster. So having various short-term feedback mechanisms that say you're actually missing the market is changing, is not necessarily a bad thing. And finally, I think the markets can be more patient than people think they are. If you look at what Amazon has done to build itself up into a world-beating company, it has always kept its operating profits pretty low. It's always invested very, very heavily in the future. It's always made big bets, and has explained that quite openly to the markets, and the markets have been patient. They've given it time to do that. So in many ways, it's a matter of how you handle the market, not the market itself. So I think we should be very, very careful in going from one extreme position to another extreme position. There's lots of value in shareholder capitalism. There's lots of value in short-term quarterly earnings. But we have to treat these things as servants, not as masters. And we have to get better, as it were, at managing shareholder capitalism. Not get rid of it, not denounce it as a crummy, lousy system that we need to get away from, but treat it in a more intelligent way. And I think there are signs that this is beginning to happen at the moment. First of all, there are many companies, a growing number of companies, that are refusing to offer guidance on quarterly earnings. Unilever, and we'll hear from the CEO of Unilever tomorrow, being one of them, IBM being another. There are many companies that do that. They can choose to opt out of the system. I think that's perfectly legitimate. There are other companies that are saying, look, we're going to play the quarterly earnings game, but we're also going to give you a longer roadmap, such as IBM, which I think has given a roadmap to 2015. So analysts have a different set of metrics, and investors have a different set of metrics to look at. I think investors can also take a longer-term view if they want to, and there are many larger and larger pools of capital, such as sovereign wealth funds, which will and are taking longer-term views of things. There are many pension funds which deliberately take the decision to invest for long-term value. I think that should be encouraged. I think it's important that directors should also take a longer-term view. One of the big problems, particularly since Sarbanes-Oxley, has been that company directors have become much more obsessed by short-term results, much more obsessed by ticking the correct boxes, much less involved in the setting of strategy. And this is, I think, something that directors themselves and CEOs are aware of. And directors, I think McKinsey did a big study of this, and what McKinsey discovered was that directors were very frustrated by the sort of information that they were given by companies, by their executives. They wanted to be involved much more with strategy than they are. So I think, again, that should be encouraged. The directors should be encouraged to take a longer-term view and should be given richer and better information on the ways that companies behave. Finally, I think there's the whole issue of CEO performance, the way that CEOs are paid and monitored. I think there's a great virtue in tying the performance and the motivation of CEOs to the long-term performance of companies, to the long-term creation of shareholder value. There's a great problem with allowing them to game the system, allowing them to decide when they sell their shares, how they sell the shares, because that gives them all sorts of incentives to drive down value in the short term, or to drive up value in the short term in order to maximize their results. So I think there are all sorts of rules that could be set about holding their shares to retirement or to after retirement, taking away their discretion about when they sell shares, which gives them an incentive to invest, to make sure to invest for the long term, to create shareholder value for the long term. So I think the critics of the system that we have at the moment are wrong when they said that it leads to financial crisis Armageddon. I think there are many reasons why we had the recent financial crisis that are completely unconnected with the pursuit of shareholder value. Asia had a financial meltdown with a very different model of capitalism. Capitalism throughout its hundreds of years of history has always moved in cycles and always seen meltdown. So I don't think you will stop that sort of cycle by getting rid of shareholder value. I think there are many merits to the pursuit of shareholder value. However, it does have a downside. It does, I think, give too many incentives to invest for the short term, to underinvest in R&D, and to game the system. The answer to that is not to get rid of it, but to tweak it, but to adjust it, because ultimately linking the performance of companies and the measurement of companies to the creation of long-term wealth, long-term shareholder value, and giving some sort of external metric to the way that you measure managers, giving some sort of sense of incentives for them to make difficult decisions is absolutely vital. So I would give 2 cheers to shareholder capitalism, 2 cheers to quarterly results, and let's improve the system rather than get rid of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. And now, hopefully, to offer us a cure for management short-sightedness, Rick Wartzman from the Drucker Institute. Rick.
Thank you, and good morning. It's a pleasure to be here today. As mentioned, I'm the executive director of the Drucker Institute in Claremont, California, a social enterprise that seeks to make people more effective and organizations more responsible and work more joyful. We do this by turning Peter Drucker's ideas and ideals into tools that aim to be both practical and inspiring. And we do this because, as Drucker so often reminded us, society is only as strong as the organizations within it. So it is with this last notion in mind, the idea of building healthy institutions so that society in turn is itself healthy, that I'd like to spend a few minutes now exploring a topic that I've been chewing on a lot lately. Are we really building a movement, a genuine cultural shift to counter maximizing shareholder value? So for those of you paying especially close attention, you'll notice that the title of my talk has actually changed from what you'll find in your programs. Originally, I was planning to focus on how to cure our managerial myopia, but as I read the abstracts submitted in advance of the forum, I realized that what I had to say on the subject was in some ways pretty close to what Adrian Wooldridge was planning to say, and indeed just did say moments ago. Now, Peter Drucker might have called an attempt to echo Adrian's insights creative imitation, noting that the creative imitator does not invent something new, rather he perfects and positions something that already exists. But given what a tough act Adrian is to follow, I decided that this was a foolish strategy, and the odds of me perfecting anything that he had to say were very small indeed. And so I decided to head in a new direction, and I hope you'll indulge me in doing so. So back to, are we really building a movement to counter maximizing shareholder value? The truth is, I'm not entirely sure. The signs out there, as I see them, are pretty mixed. Yet we do know quite a bit about how movements gain traction, and it's with these factors in mind that I'd like to briefly share where I think we stand in terms of countering one of the underlying causes of the widespread greed and short-sightedness that brought on the global financial crisis and Great Recession. To begin with, though, we should have no illusions that we're up against an incredibly powerful force. In fact, in the words of Johns Hopkins University's Stephen Tellis, maximizing shareholder value has become a key part of the most successful intellectual movement that we've seen at the intersection of law and economics in the past 30 years. The result, as Cornell's Lynn Stout acknowledges in her wonderful new book, The Shareholder Value Myth, shareholder primacy ideology still dominates business and academic circles. 50 years ago, Stout points out, if you had asked the directors or CEO of a large public company what the company's purpose was, you might have been told that the corporation had many purposes: to provide equity investors with solid returns, but also to build great products, to provide decent livelihoods for employees, and to contribute to the community and to the nation. Today, you're likely to be told that the company has but one purpose: to maximize its shareholders' wealth. In many ways, it's no wonder. As the maximized shareholder value movement gained steam through the 1980s and 90s and into the 21st century, so did executive pay, especially in the United States. Here in this chart, you can see that spike in median total compensation for large company CEOs documented in millions of constant US dollars. As we look to change things, we shouldn't underestimate how hard it's going to be to get executives to side against their own narrow self-interest. As the writer Upton Sinclair famously observed, it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. It can even be difficult to change things, however, when a top executive is deeply committed to generating profits with purpose. Consider, for instance, PepsiCo CEO Indra Nooyi, who has a compelling vision for her company to sell more and more nutritional foods and drinks, not just fare loaded with salt and sugar. As much as any CEO I know of, Nooyi embodies Peter Drucker's view that it is the function of all businesses to satisfy a social need and at the same time serve themselves by making the resolution of a social problem into a business opportunity. But Nooyi also demonstrates, as much as any CEO I know of, how immensely difficult it can be to pursue such noble ends. While she has pushed PepsiCo to reduce the fat and sugar in many of its current products, while adding whole grains, fruits, and vegetables to some of its offerings. Investors have been demanding that Newye pay more attention to the company's core products, Pepsi soft drinks and Frito-Lay chips, the not-so-good-for-you stuff. The pressure on her has been palpable. And earlier this year, though PepsiCo's board said it was standing by Newye and her team, directors also stressed that the company was, and I quote, committed to maximizing shareholder value. So where does this leave us? Are we on the cusp of generating a counter-movement of our own? What does it look like? And where will it go? In his best-selling new book, The Power of Habit, Charles Duhigg tells us that sociologists and historians have identified a three-part process which shows up time and again when it comes to successful movements. First, Duhigg says, a movement starts because of the social habits of friendship and the strong ties between close acquaintances. To illustrate, he tells the story of Rosa Parks, who, on December 1st, 1955, deep in the American South, in Montgomery, Alabama, did a remarkable thing. Parks, who was black, refused to give up her seat on a public bus to a white rider. Parks was then arrested. And at that moment, though no one on that bus knew it, the civil rights movement pivoted, Duhigg writes. Notably, Parks was not the first black person to be arrested for violating Montgomery's bus segregation laws. But what set her case apart, as Duhigg sees it, was her extensive personal network. A highly respected member of the community, Parks' many friendships and affiliations cut across the city's racial and economic lines, Duhigg says. Word of her civil disobedience quickly spread, and Parks' personal ties ensured that her action resonated and carried meaning. Political scientist Jo Freeman makes a similar point in her work on the origins of social movements. Masses alone do not form movements, however discontented they may be, she writes. If people are not linked in some manner, the protest does not become generalized and often dissolves completely. If a movement is to spread rapidly, she adds, the communications network must already exist. If only the rudiments of a network exist, movement formation requires a high input of organizing activity. So how can we get organized? Certainly, there's no shortage of intellectual ferment out there. Many leading management scholars, David Cooperrider, Michael Porter, Rosabeth Moss-Kanter, Gary Hamel, Jim Collins, Roger Martin, and others, are each in their own way pushing to reframe capitalism and move our economy and our society away from a shareholder is king mindset. The question as I see it is, where's the center of the movement? What do we even call it? Is it Martin's customer capitalism, or Porter's shared value, or Moss-Kanter's vanguard companies? One of my Drucker Institute colleagues, Lawrence Greenspun, has floated the catchphrase, comprehensive profit. One idea for creating a center comes from the author Steve Denning. He cites the way that 17 software developers came together at a ski resort in Snowbird, Utah in 2001 to create the Agile Manifesto, which has inspired many people working in the software industry to do things differently. Granted, Denning says the Agile movement is still evolving, but there's been huge progress. Tens of thousands of organizations around the world are developing software in a better way. Better for the organization, better for the developers, and better for the ultimate user. One reason why this has happened, Denning believes, is that the Agile Manifesto created a kind of banner that all of the people present could subscribe to while still continuing to pursue their own individual variations on the theme. The individual activities were transformed into a large-scale global movement because the participants saw themselves as part of something bigger. So far, though, we've yet to really find our Agile Manifesto. Meanwhile, a center of sorts may be forming under the umbrella Conscious Capitalism, the group whose members agree to adopt a higher purpose that transcends profit and explicitly manage their business for the simultaneous benefit of all their independent stakeholders, recently held its 6th annual CEO Summit. But the truth is, Conscious Capitalism remains a fairly small organization, and many of its most active members, companies like Whole Foods and the Container Store are relatively small themselves. The second step for forging a movement, according to Dewey, comes because of the so-called weak ties that hold groups together. After Rosa Parks' friends took the necessary steps to exert their influence, Dewey writes, people who hardly knew Parks decided to participate because of a social peer pressure that made it difficult to avoid joining in. The good news for us is that corporate executives seem to be especially susceptible to such peer pressure. Peter Drucker called it a bandwagon psychology. If a fellow CEO on the golf course says, we're using this and we wouldn't do without it, you have to do it too, Drucker explained. He likened this herd mentality among corporate leaders to when he was growing up here in Vienna, and everybody felt the need to be psychoanalyzed. And there was a time, Drucker added, when every child older than 4 years had to have his tonsils out. There's no shortage of major companies that do espouse, and most important, more often than not, do adhere to principles and practices that go far beyond a simplistic maximize shareholder value mantra. Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, Starbucks, Unilever, Google, Amazon, Costco, Toyota, and many, many more. These are companies that, as Peter Drucker wrote in Managing for the Future, do not attempt to maximize shareholder value or the short-term interest of any one of the enterprise's stakeholders. Rather, they maximize the wealth-producing capacity of the enterprise. We need to find more ways for the heads of these Drucker-like companies to put greater pressure on their peers by highlighting their example, by giving them encouragement and opportunities to speak out, and by standing by them as thought leaders and customers, and yes, as shareholders, when their longer-term orientation bumps up against those with a pernicious short-term horizon. We must also do more to get out the facts. As Roger Martin has made clear in his research, shareholder value hasn't been very good for shareholders. In fact, he has found returns to shareholders were better in the period before the shift to shareholder value capitalism than after, and other studies have reached a similar conclusion. The third vital step in creating a movement, Dewey says, is for the movement's leaders to give participants new habits that create a fresh sense of identity and a feeling of ownership. In the case of Rosa Parks and civil rights, Montgomery's citizens learned in mass meetings new behaviors that expanded the movement. Specifically, they learned the techniques of nonviolent protest, organizing and sit-ins, marches, and other forms of demonstration. What tools and techniques can we leverage? In his remarks this morning, Roger pointed to some potentially potent ones, including changes in securities law that would keep executives from issuing earnings guidance and trying to manage and massage Wall Street's quarter-to-quarter expectations. How about eliminating the use of stock-based compensation as an incentive, given that it has largely had the opposite effect of what was intended? But beyond taking things away, we're going to need to offer new frameworks as well. In the 21st century, we will have to learn to establish new definitions of what performance means in a given enterprise, and especially in the large publicly owned enterprise, Drucker himself advised. We will have to learn how to balance short-term results, which is what the present emphasis on shareholder value amounts to, with the long-range prosperity and survival of the enterprise. We will have to develop new measurements, Drucker told us. Some are trying. For example, Directors and Boards magazine, working with Ernst & Young, SAP, and the consulting firm Brand Velocity, has been promoting a new set of controls around what is called value risk management, an approach that seeks to give corporate leaders the sophisticated measurements they need to go beyond simply assessing and navigating financial risk, and instead help them drive real value across the enterprise through the development of new products, talent, and technology. Still, adoption is slow. At the same time, we must guard against the manipulation of any new measurements that are devised. I, for one, worry that companies will tout their allegiance to a higher purpose, and not just profits, but that in many cases, this will amount to mere lip service or a calculated PR stunt, in the same way that companies today engage in greenwashing so that they don't appear out of step with the environmental movement. We must give more consideration to the role our business schools play in perpetuating a shareholder is all point of view as well. A good number of MBA programs have become more enlightened in recent years, but certainly not all of them. Think of the MBA who comes in on the first day. Thomas Donaldson, a business ethicist at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, remarked at last summer's Aspen Ideas Festival during a session titled, "Does Maximizing Shareholder Value Endanger America's Great Companies?" These young people bring with them a kind of common sense conception of responsibility and purpose, Donaldson continued. What happens in the next 2 years? Well, we teach them how to calculate net present value, how to do regression analysis. We give them capital asset pricing. All of these tools, interestingly enough, assume, although very few say it out loud, that the sole function or purpose of the firm's financial success is for the owners. By the time the students leave, what's happened? In effect, they have had some of their common sense notions trained out of them. It's death by neglect, he said, and we haven't provided them any story to replace it. So are we building a sustainable movement or not? On the one hand, it seems pretty uncertain to me, bleak even. It's hard to know yet whether this new movement to get beyond shareholder value will have legs. The New York Times' Joseph Nocera suggested recently in his column. Measuring chief executives on the basis of their company's stock prices is easy to understand. That was always part of its appeal, he wrote. Those who want to change that have struggled to come up with breakthrough ideas that would be similarly appealing. Besides, shareholder value is so deeply entrenched, it will be difficult to dislodge. And yet, there's also cause to be more sanguine. I suspect we're all encouraged on some level, or we wouldn't be gathered here together. After I wrote a piece recently questioning whether we are truly at the dawn of a movement to counter maximizing shareholder value, Steve Denning responded to me with these comments. What is cause for confident optimism, he said, is that there is an intellectually coherent alternative to shareholder capitalism that also happens to be more profitable than shareholder capitalism. Although there are many factors driving this movement forward, it's the economics that will ensure its success. As a result, Denning said, it's now not a question of whether, it's a question of when. Here's hoping that Denning is right. If so, Peter Drucker will surely look down, smile on us all, and say, it's about time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rick. We now move to, as it were, the seated part of the panel. Patrick, would you like to give us a couple of views on the topic, and then move on to Peter, and then we will open a broader discussion.
Sure. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Well, of course, since I'm working for an American public company, creating shareholder value is, of course, the overall arching goal. But having that said, I have been practicing since 35 years creating customer value. And it was mentioned this morning, and I can only reinforce that. I think the best way to create shareholder value is really to create customer value. And for the past 110 years, 3M has been doing that through innovation. As you know, we have the image of being an innovative company, but we live it every day, and it's the central strategy in our company to be innovative and to make sure that innovation is linked to creating customer value. We call it customer-inspired innovation, just to make sure that what we do will create value to the customers. And being brief, I just would like to say the way we do it is by exposing our technology platforms to the customers, then listening to the customers of what their needs are, and hopefully being able to innovate and come up with new products that really will enhance the competitiveness of the customer, because creating customer value is to help them being more competitive in the markets they serve. So that is the overarching approach. Of course, next to the innovation, then of course you need to drive the operational excellence to make sure that you do it in the most efficient way, and you do that by having the best talent, and last but not least, you do it by being always compliant through local legislations. But we heard this morning there are a lot of loopholes around compliancy also. So we say, yes, we need to be compliant, but also people need to be ethical in what they do and try to go beyond regulations. So that's in a nutshell how we operate.
Thank you. Peter?
Well, some observations from two very different organizations. I was a senior executive of the General Electric company where we were paid largely with stock options. And while I was there during the 9 years, I think my first tranche of stock options was at $26 a share, and my last tranche was at $58 a share. And in between, the stock split twice. So we rather liked this game and learned how to manage it, as you can tell, extremely well. For the last 5 years, I've been at Siemens, where we don't have any stock options, and we're, I think, doing extremely well in competition with my old friends at GE. The one thing that I would observe, though, has nothing to do with that topic, manager compensation, but the single biggest difference I see between the two companies is the participation of the employee side. Now, you can imagine as an American showing up in a German boardroom, somewhat surprised to see these guys from the labor unions expecting actually to have something to say about running the company. And my great surprise is how good they were at it and are at it. They know our company extremely well. They have a relatively long-term view of where we should take it and frequently have very good ideas about how we could be better. And for me, the single biggest insight in moving from GE to Siemens was the valuable input of the employee side, which I had not anticipated.
Well, let me just pick up on that, because it seems to me one of the interesting things that Rick has raised is to what degree do we get a movement that changes shareholder capitalism, given how embedded it is. And it seems unlikely, correct me if I'm wrong, that General Electric anytime soon will introduce worker participation in its boardroom. So where is the sort of tipping point for companies that have possibly gone to the extreme that Adrian mentioned of pursuit of shareholder value? How do you tip that?
Well, ironically, Jack Welch did exactly that. Jack involved people on the floor. He called it workout. And when it was done well, managers were forced to listen to and respond to complaints, suggestions, and ideas from the factory floor. That was one of Jack's biggest changes. I think the technical difficulty in bringing labor unions or employees into the boardroom in the United States is the way the U.S. labor laws are structured. This is a very technical subject, but it assumes constant adversity. And the German model assumes a certain amount of agreement. So I think that there are huge impediments to importing the German system into the United States. But from a management standpoint, Jack did exactly that.
And is communication, Patrick, you've obviously worked in 3M as a company that also, as I understand it, particularly in recent years, has listened to the workforce and tried to embed some of that communication. Is that sufficient to change the character of the company in the ways that we're discussing?
Well, the tone does always need to come from the top, and of course it starts there. But I think it's one of the elements that needs to be considered also, and listening to what the employees want. And when I was running the business in the US, knowing that the labor laws are different, I always felt good when a plant was de-unionizing, and we have had a number of them, because I think that is the optimum model, that the people are happy with what we are doing when they are de-unionizing. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen in Europe because it's impossible, but that was always a kind of an entitlement result for me.
Adrian, what I wonder is you're calling for tweaks to the system rather than wholesale dismantling of the system. But as Rick has laid out, the embedded weight of incentives, of cultural resistance is very great. We've had the greatest arguably financial, corporate and economic crisis of the recent generations, and it doesn't seem to have shifted yet very much in the way in which companies themselves work. So what hope is there for getting a tweak? Is it not always going to default to the extreme version of shareholder capitalism as markets recover?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that the great virtue of shareholder capitalism is that it provides an external metric to people's performance, and secondly, that it provides, because of the focus on short-termism, a set of warning signs if things are going wrong. And I think that is very valuable, and I think it would be very worrying to forget about that. We heard about Siemens, but let's think about the example of Nokia. That was a company where everybody was very happy. It was doing very well. The managers were happy. The workers were happy. They were presumably taking part in their works councils and discussing how well things were going. And they chose to ignore a set of warning signs coming from the market, that the market was changing, they'd missed the smartphone revolution. And the result of their waiting, of them taking 4 years to get rid of the previous CEO, whose name, unfortunately, I can't pronounce, was that the company is now in the process of disintegrating. So had they paid more attention to this external metric, had they paid more attention to warning signs, they would actually have had time to correct their course, which I think they probably don't have now. So I think shareholder capitalism, by providing measures, by providing red lights flashing, can do very many valuable things. Now, as I said, I think that it can overemphasize the short term. It can give people perverse incentives to cut R&D investments and things like that. I think the system is tweakable, and I think the system is being tweaked at the moment. That directors are being given more instructions to focus on strategy. In fact, they want to focus on strategy. That many long-term investors, many big pension funds, big pools of capital are saying, no, we want to invest for long-term value rather than the short-term because there is a strict limit to how much we can game the system. And I think that companies are themselves choosing to opt out of some of these things, some of the short-term pressures, or they're saying, quite directly, quite clearly to the market, as Amazon has done, that we're not going to play this game. And the market has responded by taking them at their word. So I think you can regulate the system better, and you can create better incentives. And above all, I would say that to prevent the gaming of the system, you absolutely have to introduce rules about the way CEOs are paid, that they can't write their own rules. They can't write rules that will make sure that they have huge payouts. But again, many companies are responding to the current system by saying you've got to hold stocks till you retire or after you retire. And if you look at Kaplan's way, I mean, you presented this very dramatic chart of CEO pay going up, but I think since the financial crisis, according to University of Chicago research, pay has adjusted. It started going down. The average American CEO is paid about $10 million a year, not these dramatic, extraordinary figures that we've seen. So that this aspect of the market, the overpaying of CEOs, is now being adjusted. So I think it is possible to reform the system, and I think it's certainly not possible to introduce these other metrics without creating much more mess. I just haven't seen a compelling counter-narrative.
Rick, you think that it can be tweaked without reverting to the previous status quo?
I think it's going to take something more fundamental. First of all, I'd argue $10 million is a hell of a lot of money, and probably way too much given the relationship to what average workers make across the system. So I don't think earning 300, 400, 500 times what the average worker makes a lot of sense. But separately from that, I think the issue is so much more fundamental, and what I was trying to get at was I'm not quite sure how these things happen, how they come about. It seems to me we did move from of a world, as we got into the 80s and 90s, where the maximize shareholder value movement was really a manifestation of a larger, the marketplace became sacrosanct in so many ways. We swung way out of balance to kind of this side, and how we shift back, I think that's as much a cultural change as it is trying to change rules around the margins. I think we need a bigger cultural shift than that.
Patrick, you've seen at 3M in recent years under George Buckley a cultural shift, if you like, back to 3M in its previous state of being encouraging innovation, the famous 15% time available for innovation. But his predecessor was Jim McNerney, who had been at GE. He was one of the losers in the race to become the next chief executive after Jack Welch. And he had far more of a lean management, Six Sigma, quarterly earning attitude, as I understand it. What was the change there? How did the change work? And what were the advantages, indeed, of the McNerney approach?
Yeah, I think you need to go back a little bit to the time before Jim McNerney, where then we had roughly 100 years of history, and like I said, we were a very innovative company, and in the 90s we were doing a lot of innovation, but we were not always scaling up those innovations in the most efficient way. So I think the benefit for having Jim McNerney, in fairness to him, is that he brought us a kind of a better discipline on an operational excellence point of view. Now, of course, when you create a new mindset and you create discipline, you need to kind of overdo it in order for it to stick. And when you overdo it, you might eventually go a little bit too far. And I have always the tendency to say Jim wanted engineers to come up with an innovation the next day at 11 a.m. Well, those kind of things don't work. So you cannot Six Sigmatize lab people. And that was a little bit the issue. Then when Sir George came in, he kind of basically went back to the past and make sure that the lab people got their creativity and the time for innovation, but without giving away the good things that Jim brought in. So it's getting the balance between the two, which is important. And honestly, I think we are there now. And we need to build on that.
I mean, George Buckley's written, I know, that you still need to meet the quarterly earnings to succeed in the short term, because if you don't succeed in the short term, you're not actually there for the long term. And I actually wonder whether that's partly the key to getting this balance. Peter, what have you experienced at GE and Siemens on that?
A great similarity, and I agree with what Adrian said about the importance of economic value added or return on capital employed. I mean, these outside metrics are what keep you honest. At the end of the day, the sad truth is being a CEO is all about execution. It's sometimes mindlessly boring because there's so much repetition and attention to detail to get it right. There was a wonderful article recently, I think, in the Journal about should CEOs read novels? And the answer was no. They should be focused on execution and should be dreadfully boring in order to be successful. And I think that having that outside metric enables us who have CEO jobs to do that.
So it is in a certain sense, a sort of recipe, as Adrian says, against smugness. Is that right, Rick? You need that short term in order to keep the discipline for managers to avoid them becoming slack.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone would agree, right? The short term affects the long term. I mean, we've all said that. That all makes sense. There's nothing wrong with being healthy in the short term in pursuit of a good long term. But again, it's a matter of balance. And I think we've seen such a focus on the short term that people have forgotten the long term. Things have gotten way out of balance.
Where is the place for purpose? You mentioned purpose a lot in your discussion. Adrian, I don't think you mentioned the word purpose at all. Is there a place for purpose in this tweaked shareholder capitalism?
No, I think that in terms of what motivates workers and what motivates managers, if you say to a set of managers or a set of workers, your job is to maximize shareholder value, you probably won't get a very excited response. If you say to them, to journalists at the Financial Times or the Economist, your job is to pursue the truth, then you will get an excited response. I think shareholder value is not something that you should use to motivate people, and it's not probably the purpose of your company in the simple sense. It is an external metric to see how well you're pursuing that purpose. If your job is, if you're Pepsi Cola, your job is to produce all this ghastly, gaseous drink, and you should be focused on that and focused on making sure that everybody in the world drinks this stuff. And the byproduct of that is shareholder value and the way you're measured in terms of you pursuing your purpose. But if you look at all the world's great companies, they are focused on their products, focused on their market. They're full of people who are obsessives about news journalism, or obsessives about Pepsi Cola products, or obsessives about sticky bits of yellow stuff that you can write and stick on the wall. And that's right. That's what companies should be. So I think that it is an intellectual confusion to say that you can only motivate workers and managers by looking at this metric. The metric is something that's an external thing.
I mean, I suppose the argument was that Jack Welch, being the sort of ultimate expression of that, did become locked to the purpose of meeting quarterly earnings and keeping that share price chart and that earnings increase chart going up in a smooth line. Was that the impression, Peter, when you worked at GE?
Well, yes, we were very well rewarded for hitting the numbers to the penny every quarter. That's what made GE a trust me stock. People bought GE because, and they didn't look very carefully at the very sophisticated footnotes in the financial statements which laid out exactly what we were doing. It was all legal and it was all entirely appropriately disclosed. But there was a lot of quarter-ending shenanigans, if I can use that word, meaning it only in the most positive way, to make the quarter turn out the way we told analysts it would, and we were rewarded for that. That has consequences, which I probably shouldn't go into considering my existing fiduciary duties to GE, but it had consequences.
And at Siemens, obviously you joined at a time, and indeed for people who haven't read it, Peter Lush has written in the latest Harvard Business Review about the sense of crisis caused by the Siemens bribery scandal that led to a sort of rethinking of the culture there. Presumably quarter-ending shenanigans are not part of the picture at Siemens.
No, not at all, although we do have very rigorous return on capital employed and EVA measures to which we hold our managers accountable. I think we're blessed, A, with the sort of normative effect of the employees, who have a very long-term view, and a passion for products. And what I heard Dan say this morning about why do you build a company, money is a byproduct. We're blessed with people in our different businesses who are passionate about what they bring to their customers, whether it's CTs and MRs in healthcare, whether it's clean power generation and transmission, whether it's efficient mass transport. Our people care passionately about this, and if they can make a lot of money at the same time, that's a good thing. But the real motivation is passion for the business and the customers.
Yes, Rick.
I was curious from the two corporate practitioners here, you know, we're sort of making this assumption that measuring share price is a great way to this great external measurement. It is one, quarterly earnings is another. Are there others that you found going from the inside out that would be better for people to look at if they were trying to understand both where the company's going in the short term, but also over the longer term?
You want to start?
Sure. Well, besides the metrics that you're mentioning, I think what is important, and it is quite often overlooked to know if the company is on a longer-term traction pad, is the dividends that we are paying, that some companies are paying. 3M is paying dividends since over 90 years, and that is also a way to have a continuous stream of returning shareholder value. And I think, and the last one, which is a little bit more difficult to disclose, but I think it's also important to know what the morale is inside the company. And what we are measuring is employee engagement and those kind of things. And those are, in my opinion, for a leader in a company, also very important metrics.
You also have at 3M, I think I'm right in saying, an innovation vitality index, don't you, that measures the success and vitality or take-up of innovations?
Yeah, sure. Well, that is because we want to make sure that we are innovative, and we want to make sure that we reinvent ourselves all the time to offer the best value to the customer. And not going in all the details, the new product vitality index is basically the fraction between the sales of products that are less than 4 years old divided by the total revenue. And our goal is to have roughly 35% of our annual revenue that is coming from products that are less than 4 years old.
And was that an index that disappeared during the McNerney years?
Yes.
With damaging effect?
It became more a secondary metric, which had a little bit a reduction in the innovation side. That's true.
Okay. Peter, at Siemens, is there something similar that measures the innovation?
Yeah, we have a number of different businesses which we measure differently. They're on different innovation cycles. But I would respond to your question with one thing that sounds Pollyanna-ish, if that's a word, and something that sounds terribly cynical. The Pollyanna-ish bit is to repeat what I said earlier. We are largely a technology-driven company, and the people who run it are passionate about the advantage that their innovation brings to the world, not just to customers, but to the world. We care passionately about clean air and clean water, climate change, and that motivates the leadership. You may not believe it, but it's true. And the slightly cynical thing is, I think it was Napoleon who said, it's amazing what a man will do for a bit of colored ribbon. We find that recognizing people who've done good things in the short term or in a longer term it's better than money.
Yeah, and that's a very strong point. Certainly the sort of positive feedback, the thanking of employees, those kinds of small things, I think do weigh very heavily. But if we're still paying chief executives the 10 million, are we still not weighing our top people, and we all agree that it comes from the top down, according to the old-fashioned measure, Rick?
You know, again, there are a number of enlightened companies now that seem to be doing just that, recognizing employees. There's increasing bodies of research that say just what you're saying, namely that money is not, once you hit a certain level of income, right, money is not the great motivator. But by and large, it's funny, I keep thinking we gather among ourselves. There are great companies represented here that do, by and large, great things, that do focus on customers and products and motivating employees the right way. And yet I know out there, there's a lot that's not happening, it's not following this. And so there clearly is some disconnect going on. I mean, we know all this, and that there are huge surveys where most people are not motivated the right way. Most workers are not very engaged. They don't feel like there's purpose. They're not. We'll hear more in the workplace later in the forum. So I don't know. I'm sitting here just thinking about this great disconnect between what we know and what we say, and why more of the world is not.
Right. One last question for Peter on the panel, and then I'd like to open up to leave plenty of time for questions from the floor before we break for lunch. I was struck, Peter, by Roger Martin's point that the worry that something can be totally legal but also extremely destructive. And I just wonder whether you in your roles have any reflections about the effect of extreme pursuit of shareholder value on integrity. What's the kind of link there? Or are the two things held separately?
You sort of put the rabbit in the hat by using the word extreme. And I think what you're adverting to is when you put enormous amounts of pressure on people, they will sometimes make bad judgments. And they respond to pressure in different ways. And what we have seen in many businesses is that when pressure is too great or the incentives are too staggeringly high, people, to go back to Upton Sinclair, do things which would seem illogical because of the obvious reward or disincentive. We've seen a fair amount of that. So I think that the word extreme sort of gives you the answer you're looking for. I would say, I want to be careful how I say this, but we saw a change in business when we went from the partnership model to the broadly held, publicly traded model. My great-grandfather was personally responsible to the depositors of the bank of which he was the CEO. I think his behavior was different from those who merely manage a publicly traded institution. And as a customer of investment banking, I believe we felt a difference when the great banks went from being partnerships to being publicly traded companies. They had to do it, they had to raise capital, I understand it, but it changed behavior.
But changing back to the beginning of our panel discussion, changing back to a partnership model or even the principles of partnership is very tricky. Adrian, just final thought?
Well, I mean, I think that certain French companies in the 19th century had this peculiar combination of having partnership models with public ownership models. So the public could invest in banks and provide them with their capital and liquidity, but the people who actually worked for the banks in senior positions and ran them actually had to put their own capital at risk. And I actually think that's going back to the mid-19th century France. They saw something that was really important there, which is that at the moment, the senior management of a lot of banks are gambling with other people's money, and that's great for them. But we really need to make sure that they're putting their own capital at risk, which was the partnership model. So some way of combining partnership with public trading, two classes of shares, which A, give banks access to the capital that they need to be global organizations, but B, provide a real downside for the managers involved in those banks. I rather like that French model.
Right. Well, I'd like to open to questions from the floor. Could I just just to lay out some ground rules, if you could say who you are and who you represent. If you could speak clearly, the acoustic in the room is difficult for some people to hear. And if you could keep it to one question only, that would be helpful. I will take questions individually rather than groups, but if you could just keep to one question and make it a question rather than a statement. So those are my strictures. Yes, the gentleman here in the fourth row back.
My name is Andreas Sattelberger. I'm working for one of these boring operational excellence companies who create wealth by improving their value. My question is about the consequence of a question between stakeholders and shareholders. As it was mentioned now, isn't it important who is actually acting on behalf of these stake or shareholders? When we look at the first rule of Warren Buffett to select a company, he looks at, has the company managers that are competent and that are not corrupt? And then the question comes to, how important it is to select and sanction the top managers as a first rule, besides the secondary and third questions.
Okay, Rick, do you want to pick up on that stakeholder? Who represents the stakeholders? I mean, where's the kind of, where are stakeholders being represented in the structure that we currently see?
Me?
Yes.
I don't, not very well in some cases. Look, again, certain companies, maybe yours, they are managers who come in with a purpose mindset. They're driven by passion, not because of extreme financial pressures or extreme incentives that make them do things they're not supposed to do for the long term or even the short term sometimes. I think if I looked at all the stakeholders, I would say, in the US anyway, customers, again, great companies are focused on them, and great managers are focused on providing value to customers, and they know that shareholder value will ultimately come if they serve those customers well. Other stakeholders, communities that places do business in, I'd say the record's pretty mixed and really depends, and there's probably less focus on that by a lot of companies. Companies, as they become more global, they're less of any one place, and I think the ties are weaker to place. And the other is employees, which I think is, again, incredibly mixed. Certainly if you look at things like average worker pay, benefits, and so on, those things have greatly declined in the last couple of decades. And so it's a really mixed record on that front. Customers probably would rank highest on the list from well-run companies.
Peter, it's enshrined in the German system, and that provides obviously a structure within which certain stakeholders, employees and shareholders, can work together.
Yeah, I think that it's legally part of our mandate if we're running a German domiciled company. But I would ask a question from my American friends. What is a corporation? I mean, Mitt Romney thinks it's a person, but a corporation is a license to be a proprietor with limited liability. And it seems to me that society, in return for giving this limited liability, is entitled to ask for something in return. So it doesn't strike me as that foreign to our thinking in the United States to ask for some sort of stakeholder responsibility.
Okay, let's take another question from the floor. Lots of questions here. Yes, in the front here, Angelica.
Coleman Cooper, you've seen me before this morning. Peter Drucker Society, Europe. I have a question to Patrick and Peter. We've learned this morning that shareholder value maximization is not ideal. We learned that more than rules, we need principles. These are all very honorable views, which I share. But we are here sitting in the middle of Europe. We have heard yesterday evening that most people here come from European countries or the US. And I have been to Asia several times this year. I just returned from India 2 weeks ago. So my question to you is, we are here discussing about all these honorable views. So what is happening in Asia, which we know China will overcome the US perhaps in 2016? Other countries are thriving, India, Indonesia, I visited them all. And what is their position? Are they behind us? Are they 10 years behind? Are they still pursuing shareholder value maximization? Or are they perhaps even, yes, much further than we are? What is happening in Asia?
Why don't you go first?
You want me to go first? All right. Well, Asia's a big place, and it's very different in different parts of Asia. But I think that the notion of a proprietor running a business to make money is certainly not foreign anywhere. Even in communist China, there are plenty of very successful proprietors of businesses. The whole state-owned enterprise dynamic being a whole different topic. And I also think that in all the countries of Asia that I'm familiar with, you also see principle-driven decision-making. You also see important human values. You know, the kinds of things that we might look at somewhat suspiciously and we would consider conflicts of interest are family-led loyalties which have proven over time to be the least corrupt relationships. So I think that you don't have to dig very deep to find very common modes of behavior and interests. Bottom line, I don't think they're that different.
Patrick?
Yeah, I haven't been in Asia the last 12 months because I'm fully dedicated to Europe now. But before that, the past 10 years, I have been probably 50 times over there. I think I agree with what was said. First of all, I think you need to agree that there are two parts in Asia. There are countries which have very good standards and rules like we have, like Japan, Korea, etc. And then the other ones which are the up-and-comers. But I have seen a tremendous evolution over the past 10, 11 years that they also start to realize, a lot of those people have been educated overseas, and they also start to realize that in order to succeed, they need to do it the proper way. So I feel good that it is evolving from a business practice in the right way. It's true that then when you go to the shareholder value question, they are probably still in the middle of it like we were 10, 15 years ago. That's how I would summarize it.
Adrian, do you detect that there's some change coming from Asia?
I think that there's two very interesting things going on in Asia which come from a society that wasn't that keen on shareholder value actually discovering that it has a value. What you have with state capitalism is precisely sort of governments discovering that actually they don't want to run industries or companies. They want them to be run by professional managers with some sort of external discipline. So they've floated these companies on the stock market. They've created partly shareholder-driven companies. Also, you have these big family organizations like the Tatars being one of them, which pay much more attention now than they used to 10, 15 years ago to their shareholder returns. And what they're trying to do in these countries is create hybrid systems which use the shareholder model as an external discipline, but also use the notion of patient capital, a willingness to invest for the long term because they're building infrastructure and the rest of it. So they're trying to get the best of both worlds, and in many ways they're succeeding. If you look at what Tata did with buying Jaguar Land Rover in Britain, they bought it, they invested a lot of money in it, they did much better than its previous owner, and it's now doing really, really well. So they're getting in some ways the best of both worlds, and state capitalist companies also, you know, in terms of focusing and building infrastructure with a view to long-term investment. So what we're concerned here with is with a balance, really. I think it's a balance between the external discipline of the stock market and managing to create long-term value. And I think, as I say, you know, in all of these things, getting rid of this metric, I think, is a very, very dangerous thing. There's no alternative metric, which I found very, very compelling, but nobody wants to see a system in which you're purely managing to deceive the market in the short term, because ultimately that's counterproductive.
Okay. Further questions? Where is the microphone? Yes, we'll take one from the third row back, the lady in the third row back here.
Thank you. Marie Ringler from Ashoka. I was a bit puzzled by your definition of purpose. What I heard was that there is purpose as focus on customers, markets, products, and purpose as pure focus on shareholder value. And I can see also from the work that we as Ashoka do with many big companies that purpose obviously can go far beyond, you know, those two definitions of purpose, and that it's actually, when you talk and think about the motivation of employees, we find that whenever you know, it comes to purpose as service to communities, to society, they are very, very motivated, and they're the ones that spend long nights in the office. So maybe you would, I would really appreciate your comments and thoughts on how this whole emerging, you know, movement of social business and of big corporations incorporating socially responsible products, thinking about how they can take it further into their business, is something that you're reflecting upon.
Okay, this is a kind of evolutionary process from philanthropy as separate from corporate purpose to becoming part of social responsibility and shared value and so on, becoming part of it. Patrick, do you want to launch in on that? How does it feel at the sort of heart of a big company like 3M?
Sure, well, and of course it's very different between Europe and the US, and I have been in the US the last 10 years, since the social security is not as much developed as we know as it is here. There is much more social work done by the people for the kind of social companies which are around, and the charities, like they call it. And I was always impressed how many of our people were donating their time to do work for charities and for social work outside of the traditional work hours. And then some companies like ours are also giving them encouragements and credits in order to be able to do that. So yes, you see a lot of that happening, and I would say probably more in the US than over here.
But those are people with a purpose that is outside their work. What evidence do you see of people of the company bringing together those sorts of social objectives into the work that it does? Or is it sufficient to say, we're producing lots of innovations, we've got different shapes of post-it note, or we have different things that are encouraging people, they're making money, paying dividends? Is that sufficient?
Sure. Once a year, we have every year a campaign in September, which is really to collect money for social activities. It's called the United Way campaign, for those who know a little bit how the US is working, and that is very much encouraged by the company. Again, both ways, on trying to collect money for donations as well as time for the people in order to help the charity of their choice moving forward. So yes, it is very much encouraged by the company.
Rick, what do you see in this wider purpose of companies?
You know, first of all, I think a number of companies are learning that they can make money by solving social problems. And you're seeing that all over. I mean, Adrian's written a lot about in the developing world where companies are going, and whether it's through technology or different products for hygiene or other things, can both make money, serve customers, and do some social good all at the same time. And I think you're seeing more and more of that. You're seeing that partly because that's what customers value. So again, you know, in some ways that's being customer driven. It does give the company a larger purpose as well. The other thing you're seeing, at least around the edges in the US, are some new forms of corporate entities, L3Cs and others, that have businesses that have an expressly social purpose. In the other direction, you're seeing social enterprises, which, you know, may operate somewhat as, you know, as traditional nonprofits did in some ways, but as businesses. And so you're seeing more and more of this blurring. And I think that's a recognition that, you know, people are multidimensional, right? Sometimes we want to invest to make money. Sometimes we want to invest in things because there is a grander social purpose to it. And we have different pieces of us that each of those things can satisfy.
Okay. I want to get as many questions in as possible. So there's a gentleman at the back with his hand higher than anybody else, therefore obviously representing great enthusiasm to pose a question. May just be 7 foot tall, of course, which would be...
Hello. Okay, yeah, no, I reached out pretty quickly for that one. My name is Phil Nolting. I'm from Qualify, from Canada, one of the few Canadians here. I have a few questions, and we're talking very broadly about stakeholders. I was wondering if we could take a few minutes to get a little bit more detailed and talk specifically about one of the key stakeholders you keep alluding to, which are employees, and some of the changing themes that you guys have mentioned but haven't really drawn into, such as globalization of the workforce, wanting a smile and a pat on the back more than a raise, aging demographics of the workforce. North America alone, for example, there's 75 million people leaving in the baby boomers and only 30 million people in Gen Y to replace them. So all these statistics are very alarming, and all of you have deal with this on a daily basis. I was wondering, as a new stakeholder, as a shift from shareholder value to stakeholder value, how are your businesses changing on a day-to-day basis?
Okay, maybe a couple of practical examples of change, if there is change that you've detected. Peter, do you want to pick out something that, or is it more evolutionary than that suggests?
Yeah, I mean, the demographics are a challenge, and we look at those very carefully, and it informs where we decide to invest going forward. As talent becomes scarcer, my HR colleague says the war for talent is over. Talent won. And finding the right people to do the things we need them to do remains a challenge, and those people are not necessarily in the United States or in Canada. It's an ongoing challenge trying to match needs with capacities. I'm not sure that the stakeholder discussion changes that very much. I mean, if we were shooting just for EVA every quarter, we'd think the same way. So I think that dynamic is always there.
Patrick, any examples of the way in which that's affecting the way in which 3M works?
Yeah, first of all, about stakeholders, again, it's the employees, it's the customers, it's the suppliers, there's a lot of people involved there, but more specifically around the demography, which was what your question. It is true that there is 1 for 2 coming in to be replaced, and like everybody, we are trying to find ways around that by encouraging people to work longer and retire later, and attracting people from overseas, especially into the US. So those are the kind of elements that needs to be driven as we move forward. We don't have a magic answer to it. It's kind of acting on it as we move forward.
Rick?
I think there is an interesting link between this shareholder value, the rise of the shareholder value movement, and the way the workplace changed. And it was certainly not the only thing, and maybe not even the largest thing affecting the workplace. Trends like globalization and technology and the speed with which things are moving have all been a part of it. But to the degree that companies manage more to quarterly earnings, may have been more inclined to let large numbers of people go and downsize quickly to try and meet some numbers and massage numbers. All of that has obviously greatly affected the workplace, and I think really affected the way a younger generation now knows that it, and again, all these are factors, globalization, technology, but this as well, that they can't count on having a job necessarily for very long, for being with 1 or 2 employers, but will be with many over their lives. They, in turn, value their own mobility and flexibility, and there's definitely a link, I think, between the way younger workers have now behave and their expectations and shareholder value.
I mean, it's certainly true in my experience of talking to companies that well, many of them are looking at mega trends, and the one mega trend that seems common to all of them that they're all trying to react to is the demographic shift. Okay, another question. Yes, gentleman in the 3rd row back here with the glasses. It's coming from your right, sir.
My name is Will Hopper. I'm a former merchant banker and personally responsible for the entire global financial crisis. My question relates to an article which, a study that appeared in Fortune magazine, I think about 7 years ago, comparing the level of remuneration in different countries. And it pointed out rightly that in the States, in the top 100 companies, the CEO was paid 200 on average earnings in the company, but it compared it with 10 in Japan and 11 in Germany. Now, those are very curious figures, and my question really relates to Germany. To what extent has Germany been affected, or if you like, infected by shareholder value in its domestic companies in the last 7 years, and what might the average figure be today in Germany for large companies?
Peter, I think it's going your way.
I'm sorry to say I'm not an expert on Germany. I may work there, but I really don't have the statistics. I think you're right in saying that shareholder value has been adopted in part by many German companies, and it's now being looked at with some skepticism. But structurally, it was never possible to absorb entirely. First of all, hostile takeovers are very tough, and we also had the employee side. And to the point that was made just a minute ago about what you do in a downturn, we saw this very vividly in 2008 when, with the help of our unions and the employee side, we were able to manage the tax benefits and government benefits that were available to keep our valuable employees on the job, even if we had no work for them to do. Whereas our competitor with the two initials had to cut a lot. And so when the economy turned, we had a considerable advantage.
And Adrian, on this question of the ratio of pay here, what's going to bring that back, if anything?
Well, let me say first of all that I'm slightly skeptical about a number of these figures, because I think if you simply measure inequality in society by the level of pay, you're absolutely right. But if you go back to the 1950s, for example, in the United States, when the ratio of pay of the shop floor worker to the CEO was much, much lower, CEOs nevertheless had all sorts of informal perks, invisible perks, which kept them extremely well remunerated and extremely well paid. They also stayed in their job perhaps for 10, 20, 30 years. So I think the average CEO in the 1950s, in real terms, was probably not that much worse off than the current CEO, who seems to be paid much more. They didn't do as much work. They had more time on the golf course. They had certainly a lot more 3-martini lunches. So I think these measurements purely in terms of pay, with shareholder value driving up pay, are slightly deceptive. Secondly, if you take a country like Sweden, which has pretty low pay for the CEOs, if you look at the amount of power that a very small number of families have, it's absolutely massive. So low formal measures of inequality, actually extreme degrees of concentration of wealth. For example, in the 1970s, the Wallenberg family employed more than 50% of all manual workers in Sweden. So in these great systems of stakeholder value, which are supposedly very egalitarian societies, actually you got very extreme concentrations of power and real wealth. And thirdly, I would say that since the financial crisis, according to Steve Kaplan's figures at the University of Chicago, there's been quite a considerable adjustment in the pay of American CEOs. It's gone down quite a lot since 2009, 2010. So don't be deceived entirely by these, the Exxon CEO figures. It's a lot more complicated, the story, I think.
I know that Adrian's mentioned lunch, so I don't want to keep you from your martinis, but I'm going to take one more question, and then I have a question for you all. Yes, the lady there standing up with the blue shirt.
Good afternoon. My name is Karen Mock. I'm a student at Washington University in St. Louis in the United States. And my question is actually related to that role. I go to a top-ranked business school, and not once have I been able to take a class in my university related to principles outside of this dominant view of shareholder capitalism. Now, this is concerning to me because my institution and other academic institutions are educating future business leaders. Thus, I asked the panel, how do you see the role of business schools in cultivating a new view of shareholder capitalism? And what's the opportunity for companies that are pursuing this initiative to actually influence that education? Thank you.
Okay, that's almost a whole new panel, but let me go very briefly, one sentence from each of our panelists, starting with Adrian.
Oh, I think my biggest worry about business schools is that they don't put enough emphasis on the fragility of the system, on the fact that all these clever ideas, clever models can actually produce disaster. So I'd say they need to teach much more history and see that the history of capitalism is actually a series of crises. There's all this master of the universe stuff that we can create models that will produce prosperity forever. History is a massive example to the contrary.
Rick?
I'd strongly encourage you to transfer to the Drucker School of Management in Claremont.
Patrick.
Well, the comment that I would like to make is we don't seem to like shareholder value for all kind of good reasons. We haven't found the alternative yet. So I think the schools could maybe have think tanks or whatever to try to figure out what could be the next good model that might still deliver for the stakeholders and try to find a different model, because today we are all kind of looking for an alternative.
Peter?
I would just agree with what's been said. I mean, I think if you're taught well about being a business leader, you have to look at history and the great business leaders, and they've all had a longer term and responsible approach to business.
Great. Well, let me ask one question to the audience. I'm not going to bring anyone up to answer it individually. I'd like a show of hands, please, about the topic. How many of you believe that the world will revert to old-style shareholder capitalism? Not how many of you wish it to happen or how many don't wish it to happen, but how many of you believe that the world will revert to the shareholder capitalism of pre-crisis? And on a show of hands. Okay, and how many of you believe, again, not wishful thinking, how many of you think that it will change in the ways in which many of the panel have discussed? Yeah, I think a clear majority in favor of change. Go out and after lunch, do it for us. Thank you to the panel.
Yes, thank you to you all for this very, very interesting panel.